Last summer, I toured the Stan Hewitt Mansion located in Akron, Ohio. It's the early 20th century home built by the co-founder of the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, F.A. Sieberling, and it's the largest house built in Ohio. It's actually a small mansion, only 64,000 square feet. I say small because in comparison, the Biltmore Mansion in North Carolina is almost 3 times bigger. And as I toured through the Sieberling Mansion, I often wondered where in that house I would have enjoyed spending the most time. And our guide posed this question to us again and again. So many rooms, so many choices. And the outside grounds weren't too shabby either, spread out over 1,500 acres. And you had your choice of going through a perennial garden, an English garden, they had a Japanese garden. They even had a golf course on the grounds at the time. Well, on a side note, the Sieberlings always loved to make room for people, and they loved to entertain. The Von Trapp family sang there. Helen Keller stayed there, as did William Howard Taft. And I've been thinking about that mansion because of our gospel reading this morning. Jesus is telling his disciples to not let their hearts be troubled because he is providing a place for them, a place with many rooms. The Bible translation that we used refers to a house with many dwelling places. And the King James Version says, "In my Father's house are many mansions." I remember a time that I visited a church member and I shared these 2 different translations of that same verse with her, dwelling places versus mansions. And this wise church member said, "Well, I personally prefer getting a mansion if it's up to me." A mansion sounds a lot more impressive than a dwelling place. Well, whichever translation that you want to use, the point is that Jesus is assuring us in this passage of Scripture that there is more than enough room in his kingdom. There is more than enough room for all who seek to be followers of Jesus. It's a wonderful thing when you feel like there's room for you. No wonder that Jesus shares this good news right after telling the disciples to not let their hearts be troubled. The good news is that there is room for you and for me. I think this is a basic human need, to know that there's room for us and that we are welcomed, that we are included, and to know that someone has provided us with a safe space where we can just be ourselves and not pretend to be someone we're not. I don't know of too many people who enjoy going to places where they aren't wanted or where they are led to feel that there's no room for them. Isn't it interesting that Jesus, who says that he is going to prepare a room for us, was told at his birth in the Christmas story that there was no room for him in the inn? God somehow made room for Jesus to be born in a stable. God specializes in making room for us. Jesus had a radical welcome of all people throughout his ministry. Sure, he spent a lot of time with the 12 disciples, but he also went out of his way to connect with people that were often ignored or brushed aside in his day. Jesus was often criticized by the religious leaders of his time for being too inclusive, too welcoming. He routinely broke social and religious customs by being in human contact with those who were considered unclean. God specializes in making room. At one of the churches I was serving, we had a team of people who provided meals for the people in our community, very similar to what we do here through our Monday lunch ministry. And one day, I stopped by the church kitchen, and one of the people who helped with this ministry, a very faithful member of the church, came up to me and had this very worried look on her face. And she said to me, "Pastor Robert, we've been getting complaints from the people who live near the church that they are getting more and more angry at us for serving these meals to the people in our community every week. And they say that they're getting tired of people loitering in the alleys and they're smoking and they're littering, and they're blaming this on the meals that we're serving. And they say that they don't want those kinds of people near their homes. And we just want to make sure that it's okay for us to continue this ministry." And I said right away, without even thinking about it, "That's great news." And she said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "We must be doing something right if people are complaining about the people who are coming inside our church building. Thank you. You just made my day. Keep on doing what you're doing." I was at a church where the members complained a lot about all the fingerprints on the glass entrance doors. Too many fingerprints, they kept saying. Those doors look awful. And I kept telling them, "That's great. We must be doing something right if we have that many children putting fingerprints on doors and we can't keep up with the cleaning." Last fall, our church held a district meeting here in our church sanctuary. Probably 100 or so clergy and laity were here in our building. And we were asked to have a representative from each church stand up and share a ministry highlight from over the past year. One of our leadership board members gets up and says how Athens First is seeking to be an inclusive church where we welcome all people, especially people in the LGBTQ community. And he gave a couple of examples of how we have been doing that in particular ways. Well, later that evening, after the meeting, when I was at home, I got an email from one of the clergy who attended that meeting earlier in the day. And in the email, he said, I heard the person from your church share at the meeting, and I want you to know that you are all promoting a sinful lifestyle. You're not being biblical. I will be praying for you and for that man who shared that report." I read that email. I wanted to just send a nasty response, but then I remembered thinking to myself, this is great. We must be doing something right. Someone is angry that we're loving too many people, including too many people. One Sunday last year, I was a guest preacher at another church. And after worship, this woman came up to me, and I could tell that she really needed to tell me something. And I thought that she might want to tell me something about the sermon I gave, because it was not a bad sermon and one of my better ones. And she surprised me when, instead of feeding my ego about the sermon, she wanted to tell me something about all of you. And she said, "People that I know in the community are saying how your church, Athens First, is one of the more inclusive churches in our area." And as I was hearing this, I thought, well, this would go one of two ways here. I might get criticized here, and I sensed maybe a lecture was coming. But to my pleasant surprise, she said, "I just want you to know that I think that's great, and that says a lot about Athens First." She was complimenting all of you. And she didn't know this, but inside I had this sigh of relief, because it was refreshing to hear somebody offer that word of compliment for doing something as simple as welcoming more and more people into the life of our congregation. And I remember when I left the church that day, I kept thinking to myself, this is great. We must be doing something right. Well, many of us are aware, probably, that our denomination was supposed to be having a general conference in Minneapolis, Minnesota this week. Our denomination does this every 4 years. Delegates from all around the world come together for this general conference. But because of the coronavirus, they needed to move it to a time next year, and they are considering legislation regarding same-sex weddings and the ordination of gay and lesbian candidates for ministry. And this has been an ongoing debate in the United Methodist Church ever since 1972, when our current prohibitive language was put in the Book of Discipline. You know, it's always stressful to go through this painful debate every 4 years, and then also leading up to those general conferences as well, because you can just see how this causes so much pain, especially with people in the LGBTQ community. But I can also see the pain in so many of my clergy and laity friends who are on both sides of this debate. And these are people that I dearly love. But I remember thinking one day last year that this stress is actually a good thing, because at least we are in a denomination where we are given the freedom to debate and wrestle over these issues. Because I know of many, many, many denominations outside of the United Methodist Church that would never allow for that kind of back and forth, because in their minds, the matter is already settled, at least according to their particular biblical and theological understanding. They don't make room for other points of view. And after that thought came to my mind last year, I remember thinking, this is great. We can debate these things, and hopefully, as a result of our next General Conference, we can move forward together, people on both sides of the debate. So when Jesus tells his troubled and anxious disciples that he is preparing a place for them, he is reminding them that there is more than enough room, even bigger than the Stan Hewitt mansion here in Ohio, even bigger than the Biltmore in North Carolina. There are more rooms than you and I can ever imagine. There is room for all who follow Jesus. All who follow Jesus. There's room for you and for me. Thanks be to God.